Welcome to the deep dive for this week. Don't forget to visit the website at deepdiveau.net. Check out our socials and Patreon page at the Deep Dive AU. Subscribe via your favourite podcast app or like and subscribe at our YouTube page at the Deep Dive AU.
The Deep Dive podcast mugs are now available for purchase and are currently on sale. Just go to our merchandise page at deepdiveau.net to purchase one. Don't miss out on this opportunity to grab one for yourself or as a thoughtful gift for a fellow podcast enthusiast.
This is the Deep Dive Podcast. And here is your host, Michael Coles.
Hello and welcome to the very first Deep Dive Roundtable, and welcome to all of us watching through our Patreon page. Today we're going to discuss the National Autism Strategy released by the Australian Government on Tuesday. We're joined today by Dr. Naomi Malone, counselling psychologist, rural clinician, board approved supervisor. I'm just going to change the sort of the view here. Lecturer, AUHT, ND mental coach, consultant from Victoria. Hello, Naomi.
Hi, Michael.
So, okay, and we've got Courtney Rosato, who is, I'm just going to go through the screen here, a disability inclusion specialist, learning specialist, and policy business commerce and legal education and educator from Fremantle in WA. Hello, Courtney.
Hi, Michael. How are you going?
Good. So we'll start with you, Naomi, firstly. What is your thoughts on the good elements about the National Autism Strategy?
Oh, look, I think there's a lot that's really great about it. I think the fact that it's it's been so driven by
Recording in progress.
voices, and there's been so much of a contribution by autistic people sort of to the strategy. It is an absolute strength, and really fantastic. I think it covers a lot of aspects as well. So yeah.
So, Courtney, what is the good elements of the National Autism Strategy that you can sort of
I
put through?
completely agree with Naomi. The co-design aspect of it is so important as we move forward. And I think it really does set a precedent of how strategies, specifically in the disability space, should be designed moving forward. And I think that it really provides some clear accountabilities and really clear, I guess, guidelines, which will ensure that state and national bodies moving forward will really have a clear direction. But I think it does put a lot of accountability back on various different agencies, departments, and organizations to make sure that they're not just obviously referencing the strategy, but they're looking at their implementation. And I think that I'll speak about that a little bit more when we talk about some of the challenges with the strategy maybe moving forward. But the implementation is going to be the most critical component, because we know that the work that's been done is amazing. It's evidence-based. It really reflects the needs of the autistic community. But I really just think that implementation piece is going to be the most important moving forward.
Okay, so what do you think could be improved about the National Autism Strategy?
Yeah, look, probably the one thing and that I've observed sort of conversations around is that there's not a lot of kind of reference to school and education in it. And so yeah, I think sort of more, more detail, more sort of guidance around education and school, I think is what potentially could be improved with it.
Okay, so what would be the so Courtney? Same question with you. What do you think could be improved about the National Autism Strategy?
I completely agree with Naomi. So I'm an education professional. I worked back in Victoria when I was in Victoria on the $1.6 billion disability inclusion reforms. I was leading the reform, the rollout of the reform in the Southeast. So that was transitioning from the deficit-based medical model of disability to the strengths-based model, which is reflective of the strategy. But what I found, I've worked in Queensland education and now I'm based over here in WA. There's so much inconsistency with our education system nationally, especially in the disability inclusion space. And I would have liked this being a little bit more of a tool or a framework that could almost be used to align the states and to give a path forward and to really show what is best practice in that education space, but how implementation can look. Because I think that that's where we fall down, is that the states really grapple with how can implementation of these strategies and these recommendations look. And I just don't feel like there's enough in the strategy to really to give that framework that I think that a lot of the states and the different independent education organisations were looking for. So to completely agree with Naomi in that space.
Okay, so what would be the ideal scenario when the National Autism Strategy is implemented? I'll start with you, Naomi.
So, sorry, the ideal
Scenario when the National Autism Strategy is finally implemented.
Oh, that's a that's a great question. Look, mm, I'm thinking about, just on that level of kind of making sure that it is kind of implemented sort of all the way, because there are some really kind of fantastic sort of recommendations and strategies and frameworks within it. And I guess, probably, ideally kind of collaboration sort of between, sort of all sectors, between education and, between, NDIS and, mental health and, all sort of aspects, employment, everybody sort of coming together rather than sort of seeing each kind of part as individuals, sort of that sort of holistic view.
Courtney, what would be the ideal scenario for you when the National Autism Strategy is implemented?
I think that organisations, departments, and agencies need to start looking at some of the systemic barriers that exist right now, and they need to start looking at some of like the structural issues, and a lot of it comes down to their own policies. So there's a real lack of we've got a lot of there's a lot of policy in place that would allow for the autism strategy to be actioned, but the problem with a lot of the policies that exist at the moment is that they're not really implemented with fidelity. And I guess one of the things that I'm concerned about is that there's lots of brilliant recommendations. It's an incredible strategy. But just from my own personal experience, like I was working in the Department of Education during COVID, we have 18 months to 2-year wait lists for psychs or speechies or OTs in some of the regional areas. And that is no different here in WA. So my concern is that, there's some brilliant strategies. There's some really great ways, pathways moving forward. There's some fantastic frameworks within this. But I really worry about the workforce challenges and the lack of expertise in this space to actually be able to drive and action these changes, because we know that at the moment we've got a workforce shortage in this space, and we've also got a lot of people filling roles within the disability inclusion space that don't necessarily have the skill set or the credentials to be able to actually really delve into these recommendations from an evidence-based perspective. So I've got real concerns that what can we do to really make sure that we have a workforce that can really implement the recommendations with fidelity and that can do it from a sustainable perspective? And what are we doing from that perspective around providing opportunities for people to upskill, perhaps if they're working in spaces like, for example, educators, opportunities for them to upskill and allied to do like qualifications to become OTs or whatever it might be? Or are we identifying that there's real gaps in like certain regional communities where they're not going to have enough services available to be able to actually implement X, Y, and Z recommendations? But I'm really worried about the implementation component, because I just don't think that we have that workforce, those workforce challenges in hand at the moment, especially in regional communities. And I'm not sure if you have that same experience, Naomi, in your obviously experience working in your space.
In my space, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I've worked 21 years in rural Victoria and in very rural Victoria, and I think you're absolutely right. I think I can't sort of speak to other to other allied health professions, but I know psychology is sort of specifically our new competencies, which are actually coming into play sort of by the end of the year, actually acknowledge neurodiversity affirming practice. And so there's actually a really big implementation already of, training and, how do we actually upskill the workforce? And I think you're absolutely right. How do we do that sort of across the board, and make sure that everyone, is definitely sort of ready for the task.
So I was just basically going to ask you, what are the potential problems that you can see with the implementation of the scheme? I think one of them was actually you were going to basically sort of say the shortage of allied health professionals that would actually sort
Yeah.
of like help with these things.
Yeah.
What other sort of like potential problems that you could actually see with the potential implementation of the scheme?
I think that one of the big other, so obviously the systemic issues around like some of the systems and processes and policies that exist that are kind of outdated and aren't really reflective of a strengths-based approach. That's a big one. But I think that it's really difficult because we all have these conversations, and I had to kind of take a step away from this because I'm in a role at the moment where for the first time in my career, I'm not surrounded by like-minded professionals in the sense that I'm the only specialist doing this particular body of work. And I'm used to being around, allied health professionals or, ex-principals, like people who speak this language. And it really made me reflect and think, when we live, like we exist in kind of like not a bubble, but when you're passionate about this work and when you're neurodivergent yourself and when you're a specialist in this area, you often surround yourself with other specialists and other neurodivergent people, are the advocates, right? So my whole LinkedIn feed is people like ourselves, like advocating for this, speaking about it, casting a neurofemi lens. But I'll go into meetings with colleagues who have very high credentials and start speaking about things like universal design, assuming that that's quite a common, like integrated, implemented tool for planning, when that's not even something that is even understood or even even on the agenda. So my concern is that we all have, like, this document itself, when we read it and we understand it, we have the skill set to be able to dissect it and understand it and like talk about it from an implementation perspective. But even just in education in schools, there's still such a lack of understanding of neuroaffirming practice. It's not a term that's thrown out, especially in the government school sector, not back in Victoria anyway. There's a lot of work to support diverse learners, and there's a lot of work happening to capacity build teachers, but we're still not there. The tertiary education hasn't caught up. There's still not enough education around how do we support autistic learners, or how do we ensure that like all our workforce are coming into these graduate positions with the skill set and equipped to be able to support autistic learners. And beyond that, like in local government, state government, you might have a individual like myself who's a specialist in this area, who is advising like a department around their DAPE, their disability access and inclusion plan. But if you don't have an cross organizational wide buy-in, and you don't have an appetite for learning and opportunities to capacity build more staff, I just fear that it's going to be people like us who championing this once again. And it's just another example of autistic people having to advocate for themselves again and having like to take on the weight of the world and have burnout. And then I just worry as well, and I'm not sure if you both have this experience and what this concern, but my big concern now is I'm brilliant. This is amazing. I've been talking about this forever as an autistic person, but as a person who works in this space, great. Once again, this is all going to fall onto me because I'm the only one who has this vested interest in this, and everyone's going to come to me about how this is going to be implemented, how this is going to be, what are we going to do from an organizational perspective to tick this box and that box and this box. But once again, that's not how it should be. We know these things are best practice. We understand this affects our lives, but it needs to be neurotypical people, and it needs to be people who aren't necessarily in this space, who take it upon themselves to upskill themselves, to learn more about this, and to be the ones driving the change, not just us. Because I really worry about the autistic community now this is released, and the amount of pressure that's going to come on us to implement these recommendations. I really worry about that.
Now, Naomi, would you like to add to that?
The only thing that's I completely agree with you, Courtney. The only thing that I'd kind of add to that is I think sort of seeing that sort of holistic picture, and the interconnections. But then if each individual was able to kind of just even kind of make small changes, like just something, that's sort of how it will grow. And I think the only other thing that I'd add is, just from that sort of allied health professional perspective, having our professional bodies kind of really acknowledging and kind of not even just acknowledging, but actually having that expectation, um, sort of leads and really encourages that implementation as well. It also flows on, sort of from a tertiary education perspective, like coming sort of in it from my lecturing role. We're already sort of integrating this, like, master's courses, right from the beginning. And so, our professional bodies kind of saying, you need to do this, and things like this framework kind of really, from an education, like that tertiary education perspective, give us something to actually work with, that we can actually sort of engage in, because I think it sort of really, it also sort of starts there.
Okay,
Yeah.
so what are the current barriers that are encountered with the diagnosis process? Now, I think one of these sort of like, the elements of the National Autism Strategy is to make diagnosis a lot easier. Now, what barriers will be eliminated with this strategy, or do you feel that's going to be eliminated eliminated with this strategy? I'm a bit tongue-tied at the moment. What barriers could still be encountered despite that strategy, and what barriers could still be encountered despite the strategies still being in place?
Look, I think from my perspective, there's two main ones. One of them is most definitely financial. I think that's kind of the single biggest barrier. And as Courtney was sort of saying before, also that workforce and the clinicians actually available that are trained and skilled in doing this work, particularly in regional areas. Yeah.
I agree. I think there's a lack of like neuroaffirming professionals too, or when you have like a clinical diagnosis. I know personally with my experience with diagnosis, it was very medical, very clinical, very deficit based. And I think that undermines the strategy. Like that's not reflective of the strategy. So I think clinicians who complete diagnosis are going to have to change their practice and really like look at how they actually assess and the language they use, the environment they create. And I think it's going to really like shake up that particular part of the industry. So I think that's a really great thing. I also think what's a positive as well is that perhaps one of the barriers to diagnosis at the moment, as much as we like to say it's not, is definitely the stigma attached to this. So we know that even in some European countries that if you have an autism diagnosis, it's difficult to actually attain a visa. Like there's so many things that we don't talk about, like things that we just like don't mention, right? That autistic people, like in the back of their mind, or people who may perhaps as an adult who are developed in like they might have a really a great career and they might be quite established and they're nervous about going and getting a diagnosis and what that looks like for their career moving forward. But I think that one of the things that is really positive about this strategy is the connection to, or the focus on, more people with autism within leadership positions. And I think that really opens up this whole, like people who are, worked so hard their whole entire career and they're nervous about what this looks like for them moving forward. I think it actually gives it creates this culture where it's, no, we're going to celebrate this. This is something that we want. We want diverse thinkers. We want people who have, like, autistic people bring such a unique skill set, especially to leadership roles, and they're so underrepresented. And I think it will also put pressure on organizations to relook and reassess their reasonable adjustment policies and to start to look at more flexible ways of working. And I really think that we needed something like this to shake up what leadership looks like, because you still have these really outdated corporate structures about what a manager does, what it looks like. It has to be on site. It has to be full time. It has to be this. It has to be that. Education's done a really good job with that, with allowing principals to share jobs and have it as a 1.1 and actually be able to share a leadership role. But other organizations should look at that and think, you know what? We've got this brilliant person, but they've indicated that they're prone to like autistic burnout, or they're prone to, they may have some medical conditions that are associated with their disability, and they're requesting to do this job, which is a leadership position, but they're requesting to do it at 0.6. Absolutely. How can we make that work? you are the best person for this job. We're not going to give it to the neurotypical person sitting over there just because they can do it at 1.0 or full-time on-site or whatever it might be. So I think that this is going to be brilliant in that space, but I completely agree with Naomi. I'm really concerned about the workforce. I don't think we've got that right yet. And I just think like one of the points that Naomi raised, which is really great to hear from that psychology perspective, but I think there's inconsistencies, because if that's what your peak body's doing and, you know, there's a focus on neuroaffirming practice and that's part of your registration, that's definitely not happening in education. So there's still not a lot of talk, obviously, between the different specializations in the, you know, like I've been actively involved with grad teachers my whole career, and I can tell you that probably 1 in 10 will know a little bit about, for example, you know, sensory overload, or how do you, like, they will so quickly go towards the deficit medical based, like, you know, looking at things like the consequence for the behavior or whatever it might be. So there's definitely inconsistency there. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the background to be able to actually to change some of these things. But yeah, with the, obviously with the diagnosis, I do get concerned now that maybe we've set this amazing framework out and we're going to have all these people who are empowered to get diagnosis, but maybe we don't have the capacity to allow them to. So then what happens when someone's sitting on a wait list for 18 months or 2 years? Do they just like say, nah, throw your hands up in the air, I'm not doing it? So what are we doing to combat that?
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I know this is going on a bit of a side quest to what we discussed, but I think it's relevant to what you actually discussed before, in relation to employment. Now, I know there's a lot of autistic people that are struggling to get like employment because basically sort of they can't work full time, they can only work part time or casual jobs and stuff like that, and the amount they can do the job, but the amount of accommodations they I think the employers, I think, find it maybe far too hard or something like that. So we're trying to sort of like, you know, potentially could that be resolved by this autism strategy?
Well, I think the strategy actually gives it a really a great sort of place to sort of launch from. Like it does sort of give that like underpinning, you know, foundation for that to happen. But I think there's a lot of there's a lot of work to do. Um,
Yeah,
I
in
agree.
terms of
And I work in this space currently. So around specifically around like capacity building and building teams capacities and relooking and redeveloping policy, like reasonable adjustment policies, disability disclosure policies. And one of the big things that I find super interesting is it's not necessarily the policy, it's the implementation. So you've got so many organizations that say that they've got a reasonable adjustment policy, but they don't have a mechanism for which it can actually be monitored and reviewed. You ask the employee who has requested a reasonable adjustment, well, have you had a review of that? And they'll go, I don't know what you're talking about. Absolutely not. And what kind of mechanisms and reporting mechanisms are there in place? So when an employee requests a reasonable adjustment and then it's not actioned by the workplace, or in a lot of cases where the workplace promises the employee the world and the autistic person commences at the job for the first 2 weeks, it's like, this is fantastic, I feel so supported, this is going to be brilliant. 2 weeks later, it's an invisible disability, so everyone looks at you like you're just like everyone else, and the next minute you're being told that you've got to like work in the open, like, you know, open plan office space, and you're no
that's sort
longer
of like a
where
big killer in workplaces because
yeah.
autistic people just can't do it.
No, and they don't, and because it's an invisible disability, I do worry that there's still not that level of understanding that this is a disability. This is not something that is, oh, but you've been here now for 6 months, so you should feel comfortable here in this space now. And I do worry about that aspect, because I think that a lot of businesses will now go out and make like, if they don't already have these policies in place, they'll probably seek advice and they'll have these policies in place to obviously show from an external perspective that they're taking this strategy seriously, and you know, they're accommodating, and they're trying to you know, be seen as putting in place best practice to support autistic people. But I think that it's when you actually delve into what the organization does from that implementation perspective, and like not just when the autistic person's hired, but you need to look at like 2, 3, 4 years down the track, are the things that were promised in the induction process still in place? And this whole concept of like, oh, we'll give you these supports for the first 6 months, but they need to be reviewed and we're not sure if you'll have them next 6 months. Well, that's really like not okay, because the person has made the decision to take that position because they can exist in that workplace because of these accommodations. So then for that not to be protected, so for reasonable adjustments not to be protected is concerning, because then if a new manager comes in or there's some type of structural change, 6 months time that plan's reviewed and they're expected to now not have those adjustments in place because the companies deem them to be, not appropriate anymore because of some whatever reason. Well, that's when we have underemployment. We have like higher rates of autistic people leaving the workplace, and then there's a whole bunch of issues. So I really do worry about the implementation aspect of it, and whether we have these accountabilities in place, and whether there's going to be a bit more of a push to ensure that businesses are a bit more accountable. And it will be interesting to see whether this strategy does kind of like influence more higher up like legislative changes, and whether it really does like kind of shape the decisions that are coming through the courts as well, and whether we have a bit of precedent, because I worry about strategies being a bit of a toothless tiger. I have a law degree, and I do worry when I see the word strategy. I do sometimes feel like, especially executives and people in senior positions that have quite a lot of experience in like compliance and regulation, that if they don't see it as something that they have to do, they won't do it.
So it's basically not like the UK, where it's sort of like, it's basically sort of entrenched into law over there.
Yeah, and like America, with their IEPs, that's part of their legislative framework. That is a non-negotiable. That is a legal document that is audited and subpoenaed and taken to court. We don't have the same level of scrutiny with ours. So I do worry about that. Like, it's great. It's a fantastic starting point, but is this going to be something that then shapes legislation moving forward? Because I think that that's the next conversation that we probably need to have.
Which I think is exactly. So what barriers do you think have not been covered in this draft of in this sort of like final release of the National Autism Strategy for the next 6 years? Naomi?
That's a great question. Yeah. Look, I'd probably just come back to kind of to education, and I'm not sure how well that like the financial aspect has an economic aspect has been sort of addressed.
Yeah, and that's the next question I was going to ask. What with the amount of funding that the government has put on the table for the next 6 years? I think it was $47 million. Do you think this would be enough, or do we need a lot more to be able to sort of like get these all these strategies into place?
I think we need a lot more.
Which makes sense. Totally makes sense, I think. Courtney, do you agree?
Yeah, and I think there's going to be inequities with funding distribution and things like that, and then how you whether states are going to fund it like as in addition to that, and what that's going to look like. And I think that there's already a lot of inequality amongst different states funding different things. So I think that once again, you'll probably have the states that are quite progressive in this space, providing more incentive and more funding, and they'll move forward. And then the states that traditionally or historically haven't necessarily seen this as priority, once again, probably won't provide as much funding, and once again, they won't progress. So there'll be like, once again, that I think that the rollout will look inconsistent based on, previous types of reforms in this space as well. And it is a bit of a worry. And I think that the other thing it probably hasn't considered enough is the workforce shortages that we've spoken about in detail. But I just don't think that there's a clear plan moving forward. What are we doing in this space, especially like within, like, if we look at like there's a lack of education related content within the strategy, but that's a pitfall. But we know that that's critical and that's so important, but we haven't had that conversation about the fact that we had one of the most difficult historical in history as far as like actually getting teachers in classrooms and actually getting qualified teachers that understand diverse needs and that have the ability to be able to like actually teach and have such a positive impact on autistic students. So once again, that's only in education. That's not to say like, psychology and OT and other allied health. So what are we actually doing as far as a framework moving forward to combat these workforce shortages as well?
Absolutely, Courtney. And I think, from that allied health perspective, like there's already shortages kind of across the board in all of those areas. Yeah.
Okay, and on that note, thank you very much for bringing your sort of passion to the table here on the Deep Dive Roundtable today. Thank you very much, and I'm sure everybody has sort of got their opinion on this. So why don't you sort of email us admin@deepdiveau.net. Thank you very much, Naomi and Courtney, for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Having us.
Right. Thanks, guys.